There are five different types of analysis that one can use on political communication. Of course, there are more approaches one may use, but these are the main ones and the ones that we'll mostly be talking about during this class. The first is discourse analysis, or studying the content of a particular speech, the words, the use of words, and so on. The second is symbolic analysis, studying the use of symbols or images that are meant to represent something abstract. The third is nonverbal communication and cues, facial expressions, posture, hands motions, the way that someone looks at the camera, the way that someone addresses the camera. Visual communication, which is communication by visual images and not words. Things that, for instance, we'll see on YouTube, or pictures we'll see on the news, or films we'll see on the news. And finally, structural analysis, which is looking into the forces behind political communication, particularly those that go into the construction of political reality, especially in the media, economic forces, social forces, cultural forces, and others. Discourse analysis involves actually looking at the text of speeches or debates for the meaning and use of words and phrases and so on. Does someone tend to repeat a phrase over and over again? Does someone tend to use a series of statements whereby it's almost a litany, somewhat resembling the Sermon on the Mount by Christ, where they say, this is an example of the freedom in America. This is an example of the freedom in America. This is an example of the freedom in America. What do they have as direct or indirect messages? A lot of times when politicians will speak about one thing, they're actually speaking about another. This has been particularly true, unfortunately, many times when politicians are talking about race, when they will refer to things like welfare mothers or high crime in urban areas. A lot of times what the indirect message is that the racial composition of those areas or those people who are on welfare are the reason why this is happening, even despite the fact that that is not true. Symbolic analysis looks at the symbols that the communicator tries to evoke, tries to bring forward to us to get some kind of potential reaction. For instance, the American dream. Think for a moment. What does the American dream mean to you? For some people, it means economic success. For some people, other people, it means the fact that you can be whatever you want to be in America. For other people, it means a house with a white picket fence and a family. All of these different things are possible interpretations of the American dream. And as much as that phrase is used, in many cases, it is used in all different kinds of ways. Often symbols are used in different ways in different contexts, especially verbal versus visual contexts. When the president poses with the background of American flags, it states something. There is a reason why when the president speaks, he speaks at a podium with the presidential seal on it. That seal conveys a sense of authority. Nonverbal communication often occurs in cases where the individual is not even aware that they are communicating something. The classic case I always like to speak about is in the 1992 presidential debate. George H.W. Bush at one point actually checked his watch to see what time it was. That's always a bad move because the message that it conveys to the people that are watching is, I'd really rather be somewhere else. I really don't want to be on this stage. I really don't feel like debating these other people. There's a lot of things that I could be doing that I'd rather be doing. And that shows disrespect for the audience and it shows disrespect for the voters who are watching. When Bill Clinton in 1992 in the presidential debates, in the town hall debate, walked towards the audience and spoke to the people directly, That indicated to the person he was speaking to that you are personally important to me. George H.W. Bush, on the other hand, oftentimes, especially in his concluding statement, got up and stood behind his chair. It almost looked like he was trying to block the audience from him. Now, the fact is, that was likely not the case. He's used to speaking behind a podium. It's probably the reason why he did it. But that's not the message that was sent across non-verbally. And it was not a good way to communicate with people. Visual images are important to analyze, but difficult because they aren't interpreted logically. The very famous political communication analyst, Neil Postman, once said, "You can't judge the truth of an image. You can only say whether you like it or not." And what he meant by that was that images don't have logic necessarily. The picture that you see is something that you react to positively or negatively. This is one of the advantages that Ronald Reagan had when he spoke. Many times it wasn't so much his words, but the way that he would address a camera. In fact, one man once said he could speak to a camera as if he were speaking to a person. And that was something that many people find very, very difficult. And the impression that people got is, well, Reagan is a warm person because of the way he's communicating. But the fact is, he's talking to a camera. He's talking to a black box. Also, a lot of times the networks find that their stories have effects that are not exactly what they think they're going to be. Before the 1984 presidential election, one of the networks ran a story on the environment that featured Ronald Reagan standing next to the ocean and being by trees and things like that, while they described the fact that Ronald Reagan's environmental record was, for the most part, pretty terrible. The next day, they got a call from the White House. And the network figured that, oh my gosh, the White House is really going to give it to us for this story. Instead, the White House thanked them for it. And they said, but didn't you listen to the story? Didn't you listen to the things that we were saying about the president's environmental record? And the response was, look, nobody was listening to what you were saying. They were looking at the pictures. And the pictures conveyed a very friendly, smiling President of the United States. And that's all they're going to remember. That's why visual images are so important in political communication. Structural analysis is something that has become more and more important in recent years because that analyzes how the structure of the media and other forms of political communication affect messages. The fact that we have a 24/7 news cycle now, blogs, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of these things affect the way that we absorb news, and we absorb news differently based upon the structure of the media that conveys it to us. The question is, how does it affect the ability of media to report stories accurately and objectively? How do they remain objective? One of the things that is very important, and that we'll talk about through the course of the semester, is the way the economics of the news media has changed over the years. In fact, you may not know this, but one of the main reasons why the press, which used to be completely biased, there were Democratic newspapers and Republican newspapers, turned to objectivity as a moral imperative, as something that they had to stick to, was because of economics and technological change. Once it became possible to mass produce newspapers so that they could and transport them to cities outside of where the newspaper was printed, the newspapers realized that they could reach a bigger market if they didn't bias their responses to just one audience. This was especially important because the fact is that newspapers generally are not paid for by the price that you pay for the newspaper, but rather by the advertising that they have in the newspaper, both the quantity of it, how many people actually see those ads, and the quality of the audience. What are their incomes? Are they people that are likely to buy things? For instance, the New York Times has a very high income group that reads the newspaper. Hence, they can charge a lot more for their ads and they can have luxury products in their ads. Because of this, so many newspapers started embracing objectivity. Now, one may say, well, what about Fox News? Fox News and other cable channels aren't about objectivity. That may be true. But the fact is that what they did was to discover a niche market, a market that was a smaller audience, but still was profitable for them to reach. And therefore, they could show certain biases in their reporting, and people who agreed with them would watch those networks. So the fact is that the economic structure behind the media has profound effects upon what we see and what we hear. Finally, there are manifest and latent forms of political speeches. Manifest forms are explicit in their intention and purposes. When a president or politician wants to rally support for their cause and they speak to that directly, that is one of the things that they are stating explicitly. But many times they have things that are hidden in their intentions. A little bit later on, when we talk about the speeches around the Challenger disaster and the speech that Clinton gave at the memorial for the victims in Oklahoma City, you will see both manifest messages of honoring those who died and hidden messages about the nature of space exploration and our technology in the Challenger speech, and in Clinton's speech, hidden latent messages about what happens when one raises the temperature in politics and makes it too hostile. Finally, there are a lot of synthetic experiences from social reality from media. Okay, first of all, a low tolerance for boredom and inactivity. Pictures have become much more important on media than they ever were before because otherwise people will lose interest. Also, a lot of times the media tends to be in the United States, even the mainstream media tends to focus more on national stories than international stories, often to the detriment of the information that citizens need to make choices. We have heightened expectations of perfection and high-level performance among our politicians, in part because we're used to television programs where everything is solved in 30 to 60 minutes, or more realistically, in 22 to 42 or 44 minutes without commercials. We expect quick, effective, and neat resolutions of problems, despite the fact that politics does not work like that. We have misperceptions of certain classes of physical and social events. The fact is that virtual violence, many people have argued, desensitizes us to actual violence, especially in war coverage. And finally, we have limited contact with and a superficial view of our own inhabited environment. One of the things that's been true for many years is that in the United States, when crime has been going down, at the same time, people became more afraid of crime. And the reason for that was because local news stations were seeing their ratings drop, and in order to increase their ratings, started focusing on the details of crimes that were happening in their areas. This in turn, unfortunately, made Americans more likely to think that crime rates were going up, and as night follows the day, to ask or demand that politicians do something about it, even though we were in an environment where crime was going down over the years in the population. All of these things can have effects upon our perception of politics and our society. Finally, I want to speak about the 5 functions of political communication. It is critical that you understand these. The first is information dissemination. What is the information that a speech is trying to tell you? What is its purpose? Why are we here? If you look at a speech, for instance, like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the purpose of his speech, the reason why he was giving that speech was to speak in Washington, D.C. to a huge throng of people about the inequalities that existed for African Americans in the United States and how this was inconsistent with the realities of the country and was inconsistent with our founding principles. And he always came back to that. Second, projecting from past to future and future to past. Political communication doesn't just exist for the moment. Political communication exists with a historical tradition and a future path. And the idea is that political communication should link these things together. When John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," he is saying, look to the past and see the traditions of what you gained from being an American. Now look to the future and see how you can contribute to the country's future and what you can do to make this country better. Agenda setting is one of the more difficult aspects of political communication to unearth in certain cases, but it is one of the most important. Agenda setting is almost like, in terms of seeing a communicator as a magician. The magician, when he does something or she does something, looks to distract you from the way they are doing the trick and to focus your attention on the supposed magic that they are doing. This is often called misdirection. Agenda setting is not so much an example of trying to fool you as it is an example of trying to get you to focus on the issue that the communicator wants you to focus upon rather than raising opposite issues. If a president talks about the courage of troops under fire and the wonderful things that they are doing serving this country, they obviously also do not want you to focus upon the cost of the military intervention and whether it is worthwhile or not. That may seem a little bit hard as a message, but the fact is that they want to focus on the courage and the sacrifice rather than the cost-benefit analysis of whether it is really worth it. And that is one way that politicians often do this. Presidents often do this, especially in a time of war. Always look for what they want you to focus upon, and then look at alternative questions that what they're talking about may raise that they don't want to talk about because it would not help them. Interpretation and linkage means how do they fit things together? How do they combine events together? There was a story one time where Ronald Reagan was talking about the decline in SAT scores among high school students. Now, the actual reason for that, interestingly enough, was that more and more high school students were taking SATs because more were going to college. And the fact is that when you get a set of students taking SATs, which is less select than before, they used to self-select, only the best students would go to college, the score is going to come down. But Ronald Reagan said, it's interesting, that the more government has gotten involved in education, the more scores have gone down. Well, the fact is, those are two things over time that, yes, did occur at the same time, more or less, but had nothing to do with each other. Interpretation and linkage, a lot of times, tries to put together things that may not have anything to do with each other, but that the person communicating wants you to believe are linked. And finally, perhaps one of the simplest ones is action stimulation. Political communication is designed to stimulate you to action, to have you do something. It could be something as simple as vote for me in the next election, support my policies. Or it could be something as dramatic as let's walk down to the Capitol and I will walk with you and stop the Congress from tallying the electoral votes in the 2020 election. There is always some action that The communicator wants the constituent to take, the person listening to them to take. And if it were not the case, they wouldn't be speaking to them. When Biden talks about, or talked about recently, his push for vaccines, he does this and talking about the Omicron variant and so on in COVID-19, what he's basically saying is, get vaccinated. That's the action he wants to stimulate. Get more people vaccinated. Whether you agree or disagree, that's what he's trying to stimulate. So all of political communication is dedicated to stimulating action. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. These 5 functions of political communication will play out in very important ways as we look at specific speeches. So, learn them, live them, and be prepared to use them for the next day when we actually look at political speeches. Thank you, and goodbye.